Some miracles begin so quietly that the world almost mistakes them for silence. The snow had buried the mountains of northern Montana beneath a pale sky that seemed to stretch forever, turning every pine tree into a ghostly silhouette and every winding road into a ribbon of white uncertainty. Claire Whitmore tightened the scarf around her neck as she stepped away from the idling news van, her boots sinking several inches into fresh powder with each careful step. At 31, she had reported hurricanes along the Gulf Coast, wildfires in California, and floods across the Midwest, yet there was something about a winter landscape that unsettled her more than any storm. Snow erased footprints, softened sound, and hid stories no one intended to be found. She lifted her camera toward the endless valley, searching for one final shot before daylight faded behind the clouds. The wind whispered across the ridge, carrying tiny crystals that shimmered like scattered glass. Nothing moved except the slow dance of snowflakes. Then, far below, something interrupted the perfect white. Three dark shapes rested near a cluster of frost-covered pines, too symmetrical to be fallen branches and too still to be wildlife. Claire lowered the camera, narrowing her eyes. Curiosity overcame caution. She descended the gentle slope, each breath forming pale clouds before her face while the silence around her grew heavier with every yard. As she drew closer, the shapes slowly became recognizable. A man lay against the base of a pine tree, thick winter clothing dusted completely in snow, his wrists secured behind him with heavy restraints. Beside him rested two German shepherds, their sable coats nearly hidden beneath a blanket of frost. None of them appeared to move. Claire's heartbeat quickened. She dropped to one knee several feet away, instinctively reaching for the emergency radio clipped to her jacket, but something made her hesitate. The man's face, weathered yet unmistakably disciplined, carried the quiet strength of someone who had spent years serving others before himself. A worn military patch remained stitched to his jacket sleeve, nearly buried beneath ice. She could not read every letter, but one word stood clear enough through the frost. Seal. Her breath caught in her throat. "Can you hear me?" she called softly, unwilling to shatter the stillness that surrounded them. No answer came. The only sound was the lonely sigh of wind weaving through the evergreens overhead. She shifted her attention toward the dogs. One lay curled close against the man's side, as though refusing to abandon its post even after every ounce of strength had disappeared. The second rested several feet away, head lowered into the snow, motionless beneath a thin layer of drifting flakes. Claire slowly reached for her satellite phone, preparing to call search and rescue, when a faint instinct urged her to wait one more second. The mountain fell silent again. Then it happened. The nearest German shepherd's ear twitched almost imperceptibly. A single breath escaped its muzzle, sending a tiny cloud into the frozen air before one amber eye opened just enough to meet hers. It did not growl. It did not bark. It simply looked at her with quiet determination, as though carrying one final message across the snow. In that fragile moment, Claire realized she had not discovered the end of someone's story. She had arrived at the only moment when it still had a chance to continue. Claire remained perfectly still as the German shepherd held her gaze, its amber eye carrying neither fear nor aggression, only an exhausted resolve that seemed almost human. The dog's breathing was shallow, but steady enough to tell her one undeniable truth. Hope had not left this mountain. She slowly lowered herself into the snow, keeping her hands visible, speaking in the calm voice she had learned from years of interviewing frightened strangers after disasters. "You are all right. I am here now." The shepherd did not move toward her. Instead, he struggled to lift his head before letting it fall gently against the shoulder of the unconscious man, as though reminding her who mattered most. Claire swallowed the lump forming in her throat and reached for her satellite phone. Her fingers trembled as she contacted emergency dispatch, carefully giving the coordinates while glancing repeatedly toward the motionless figures before her. The dispatcher promised that a rescue team was already preparing to leave the nearest ranger station, but heavy snowfall meant they would need nearly 45 minutes to reach the location. 45 minutes suddenly felt like an eternity. She slipped off one insulated blanket from the emergency kit inside her backpack and slowly unfolded it. The German shepherd watched every movement without taking his eye away from the man beside him. Claire paused before moving closer. "I am only trying to keep him warm," she whispered. The dog blinked once. It was the closest thing to permission she expected to receive. She gently spread the blanket across the man's shoulders, noticing the weathered lines of his face beneath the frost. Even unconscious, he carried the unmistakable bearing of someone shaped by discipline rather than comfort. A faded wedding band rested on his left hand, scratched from years of wear, while a worn metal dog tag hung partly exposed beneath his winter jacket. The name engraved upon it caught only a glimpse of daylight before disappearing beneath drifting snow. Ethan Calloway. Claire quietly repeated the name in her mind, committing it to memory before looking toward the second German shepherd lying several feet away. Unlike the first dog, this one had not moved at all. Snow continued settling across his broad back until he appeared almost sculpted from ice. Claire's heart tightened. She wished she could check him immediately, yet every instinct told her not to separate either dog from the man they had refused to abandon. The living shepherd seemed to understand exactly what she was thinking. With remarkable effort, he stretched one front paw through the snow until it rested gently against the still body beside him, then looked back at Claire once more. There was no panic in those tired eyes, only a silent request that needed no words. Do not leave him behind. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying distant echoes that barely reached the ridge. Sirens. Faint, but growing closer. Claire exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes, grateful that someone else would soon shoulder the impossible weight of this discovery. Yet as she looked again at the faithful German shepherd refusing to surrender his place, another question quietly settled into her heart. Whatever had happened on this mountain had begun long before she arrived, and somehow the answers were still waiting beneath the snow. The first rescue snowmobiles finally appeared through the curtain of white, their headlights cutting pale tunnels across the ridge while the distant hum of their engines echoed softly between the pines. Claire rose and waved both arms until the emergency team spotted her. Within moments, paramedics and forest rangers surrounded the small clearing with practiced calm, speaking in quiet voices that respected both the mountain and the fragile scene before them. One medic knelt beside Ethan Calloway while another carefully approached the German shepherd, whose amber eyes never left his master's face. "Easy, boy," the medic whispered. "We are here to help." The dog answered only by drawing a slow breath before placing his muzzle gently against Ethan's shoulder once more. It was not fear that held him there. It was devotion. Claire stepped back, allowing the professionals to work, yet she could not stop watching the remarkable animal. Every movement he made seemed measured by one simple purpose. Stay with him. A ranger carefully examined the second German shepherd lying several feet away. Snow brushed gently from the broad sable coat until the familiar shape beneath became visible again. The ranger paused, lowering his head with quiet respect before covering the faithful companion with a thermal blanket. Claire noticed the living shepherd watching every motion. For one heartbreaking second, the dog attempted to rise. His front legs trembled beneath him before giving way again, leaving him resting exactly where he had chosen to remain all this time, between Ethan and his fallen partner. One of the paramedics looked toward Claire. "Did you find them like this?" She nodded. The dog was the only one who moved. The medic glanced back at the shepherd with visible admiration. He probably kept his owner alive longer than anyone realizes. Those words settled deeply inside Claire. She had reported countless rescues over the years, but none had begun with a single exhausted glance from a dog that refused to surrender. As the rescue team carefully removed the restraints from Ethan and prepared him for transport, something unexpected happened. Although barely conscious himself, the shepherd dragged his body forward through the snow one painful inch at a time until his nose touched Ethan's gloved hand. The unconscious man did not awaken, yet his fingers seemed to relax ever so slightly beneath the thick winter glove, almost as if some forgotten instinct still recognized the familiar presence beside him. No one spoke. Even the rescue crew allowed the quiet moment to linger. It felt less like coincidence and more like a promise that had survived the storm. Claire instinctively lifted her camera, then lowered it again without taking a single photograph. Some moments deserved witnesses more than headlines. As Ethan was secured onto the rescue sled, the shepherd finally allowed the veterinarians to wrap him in warm blankets. His tired eyes followed Ethan until both were positioned side by side for the journey down the mountain. Only then did the faithful dog close his eyes for the first time since Claire had arrived. Watching the convoy disappear into the falling snow, she realized the real story had not started on this frozen hillside. Whatever had bound one Navy SEAL and two loyal German shepherds together had begun days earlier, and somewhere beneath the silence of this mountain waited the truth that none of them had yet spoken. The ambulance disappeared into the white horizon with its lights glowing softly through the snowfall, and for the first time that afternoon Claire felt the mountain exhale. She remained standing where the tracks faded into the drifting snow until one of the forest rangers approached and handed her a steaming paper cup of coffee. The warmth spread through her frozen hands, but it did little to quiet the questions filling her mind. She had come searching for the story of another winter storm. Instead, she had stumbled upon a silence that seemed far older than the snow itself. Back at the small regional medical center nearly 50 miles away, the emergency entrance buzzed with quiet urgency as doctors wheeled Ethan Calloway into intensive care while veterinarians carried the surviving German shepherd through a separate set of doors only a few yards away. The dog refused every attempt to settle onto the examination table until one veterinary technician gently turned him so he could see the hallway leading toward Ethan's room. Only then did his tense breathing begin to slow. One of the older veterinarians studied the shepherd with quiet admiration before reading the faded name stitched onto the weathered tactical collar. Ghost. The name seemed strangely fitting. He had endured the mountain like something that refused to disappear. Claire waited in the family lounge despite having no connection to the man beyond a single extraordinary afternoon. She replayed every moment in her memory, especially the way Ghost had looked at her before help arrived. It had not been the desperate gaze of an animal pleading for rescue. It had been the steady confidence of a loyal partner who believed someone would eventually answer. That certainly stayed with her. Late that evening, a nurse quietly approached carrying a small plastic evidence bag recovered from Ethan's jacket before treatment. Inside rested a weathered leather wallet, a silver wedding band attached to a thin chain, and a folded photograph protected inside a clear waterproof sleeve. The nurse explained that no immediate relatives had yet been reached and asked Claire whether she recognized anyone in the picture. She gently shook her head as the photograph was held beneath the waiting room lights. Ethan stood smiling beside two younger German shepherds whose ears were slightly too large for their growing bodies. One wore the same determined amber eyes as Ghost. The other carried a darker coat and an expression that seemed endlessly curious. On the back of the photograph, written carefully in faded black ink, were only 6 simple words. Brothers are chosen. Family is earned. Claire felt a quiet ache settle inside her chest. Whatever journey had led them onto that mountain had not begun with duty alone. It had been built through years of trust no storm could erase. Just before midnight, another veterinarian entered the hallway carrying difficult news delivered with remarkable gentleness. The second German shepherd had not survived the mountain. His name, they had learned from the matching collar, was Valor. Ghost remained alive, but even while resting beneath warm blankets, he refused food, water, or sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. Every few moments, he lifted his head toward the hallway leading to intensive care, listening for a voice that had not yet called his name. Claire watched through the observation window as Ghost quietly waited beneath the soft hospital lights, his tired eyes fixed on a closed door. In that silent vigil, she realized the greatest battle had never been against the storm outside. It was the quiet promise inside one faithful heart that refused to believe the story was over. Morning arrived quietly beneath a pale winter sky, the first rays of sunlight spilling across the hospital windows like gentle promises after a long night. Claire had never intended to stay until dawn, yet every time she considered leaving, something urged her to remain. She sat alone in the nearly empty waiting area with a notebook resting unopened on her lap. For once, the story mattered more than the article. Through the observation window, Ghost lay curled upon a thick blanket, his breathing stronger than it had been the night before, though his amber eyes remained fixed on the hallway leading toward intensive care. A veterinary technician carried in fresh food and warm water, placing both bowls within easy reach. Ghost lifted his head politely, sniffed once, then looked away. It was not weakness that kept him from eating. It was waiting. The older veterinarian quietly folded his arms and sighed. Sometimes loyalty outweighs instinct. he said softly to no one in particular. Some dogs simply decide that their place is beside one person, even when that person cannot see them. Claire looked through the glass again, feeling those words settle deeply within her heart. An hour later, a nurse emerged from intensive care with the smallest hint of relief brightening her tired face. Ethan's condition had stabilized. He remained unconscious, but his breathing had become more regular, and his body was beginning to respond to treatment. It was not a miracle yet, only the first careful step toward one. The veterinarian exchanged a quiet glance with the nurse before turning toward Ghost. "I think he deserves to know." They carefully opened the kennel door. Ghost stood slowly, every movement still stiff from exhaustion. Yet the moment the hallway became visible, his ears lifted with unmistakable purpose. He followed the veterinarian at an unhurried pace, his nails clicking softly against the polished floor while nurses instinctively stepped aside. No one spoke. The hallway itself seemed to recognize the importance of the moment. Ghost stopped outside Ethan's room before the door even opened. His nose lifted gently into the air as though searching for a familiar scent hidden beneath antiseptic and medicine. Then his tail moved. Only once. Slow, uncertain, but filled with hope. Claire watched from several yards away, hardly daring to breathe. The attending physician gave a small nod and opened the door. Ghost stepped inside without hesitation. Ethan remained asleep beneath warm blankets, medical equipment humming softly around him. His face no longer covered with frost, but still marked by days of hardship. Ghost approached the bedside until his nose rested lightly against the edge of the mattress. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply remained there, watching the steady rise and fall of Ethan's breathing, as though counting every precious breath for himself. Several quiet minutes passed. Then something almost invisible happened. Ethan's fingers twitched beneath the blanket. Ghost immediately raised his head. Another small movement followed. This time the fingers slowly curled, almost searching for something they had reached for countless times before. Ghost gently placed his muzzle beneath Ethan's hand. The room fell completely silent. Ethan's fingers settled weakly into the thick fur along Ghost's forehead. It lasted only a moment, little more than a faint touch, yet tears quietly filled Claire's eyes because she understood what every person in that room had just witnessed. Recognition had returned before consciousness. Even while sleep still held him, Ethan had remembered exactly where his faithful companion belonged. The following afternoon, the snowfall outside the hospital had finally begun to ease, leaving the surrounding hills wrapped in a quiet blanket that reflected the soft winter sun. Inside the intensive care unit, time seemed to move differently. Machines hummed with steady rhythm, nurses spoke in gentle voices, and every small improvement felt larger than words could explain. Claire returned with a fresh notebook, determined at last to begin writing. Yet every sentence she attempted felt incomplete. Facts alone could never explain why a wounded dog had chosen faith over survival or why a stranger had remained beside people she had met only a day before. Some stories demanded patience before they revealed their truth. Ghost had finally accepted a few bites of food that morning, but only after the veterinarian wheeled his bed closer to Ethan's room. Even then, the faithful shepherd paused after every mouthful, lifting his ears toward the familiar heartbeat monitor beyond the partially open door. It was as though he needed constant reassurance that the sound was still there. The older veterinarian smiled quietly. He is eating because he believes his partner will need him again. Claire had covered enough human resilience to understand determination, yet watching it inside a German shepherd somehow carried even greater weight. Later that afternoon, Ethan's eyelids stirred beneath the pale hospital lights. A nurse immediately stepped closer while the attending physician checked the monitors with cautious optimism. Ghost sensed the change before anyone spoke. He slowly rose from his blanket and walked to the doorway, stopping exactly where he could see the bed without crossing into the room. Ethan's breathing deepened. His eyes opened only slightly at first, unfocused against the brightness overhead. The physician greeted him calmly, explaining where he was and assuring him that he was safe. Ethan listened in silence, his expression marked more by confusion than fear. His lips moved faintly before any clear words emerged. Ghost. It was little more than a whisper, yet everyone in the room heard it. Before the physician could answer, Ghost stepped quietly across the doorway. The shepherd's ears lifted, and his tail gave one slow sweep across the polished floor. Ethan turned his head with visible effort until his eyes finally found the familiar amber gaze waiting only a few feet away. Relief softened every line of his weathered face. No dramatic reunion followed. No tears burst forth. Instead, Ethan simply smiled with the peaceful gratitude of a man who had just recovered the one certainty he believed he had lost. He slowly extended a trembling hand beyond the blanket. Ghost crossed the remaining distance without hesitation and rested his head beneath Ethan's fingers exactly as he had countless times before. The room remained silent except for the gentle rhythm of the monitors. Claire quietly lowered her camera once again. She realized she had now witnessed two moments that no photograph could ever truly capture. The first had been a dog refusing to abandon hope on a frozen mountain. The second was hope quietly answering back inside a hospital room. Yet as Ethan's strength gradually returned, his eyes searched beyond Ghost toward the empty space near the window. His smile faded ever so slightly. He did not ask the question aloud, but everyone understood it. There should have been another loyal companion standing there. The absence of valor filled the room more deeply than words ever could, and Claire sensed that the hardest part of this journey had only just begun. The room remained peaceful long after the physicians finished their examinations, leaving only the quiet melody of steady breathing and the muted rhythm of monitors marking the passage of time. Outside the hospital windows, the last clouds of the storm drifted east, revealing a winter sky washed clean by snow and silence. Ethan rested against the raised hospital bed, noticeably stronger than the day before, though every movement still carried the weight of exhaustion. Ghost lay beside the bed on a thick blanket provided by the veterinary staff, his head resting across his front paws, never allowing more than a few feet to separate him from the man he had protected for so many years. Claire sat quietly in the corner with her notebook still unopened. She had stopped trying to force the story onto paper. Instead, she simply watched it unfold. Late that afternoon, the attending physician stepped inside carrying a small wooden box wrapped in dark blue cloth. He spoke gently, giving Ethan as much time as he needed before placing the box on the bedside table. No one explained what it contained. No explanation was necessary. Ethan stared at it for several long seconds without reaching for it. His eyes slowly drifted toward Ghost before returning to the box once again. Finally, with hands that still trembled from weakness, he lifted the lid. Inside rested Valor's weathered leather collar, carefully cleaned and preserved after the rescue team recovered it on the mountain. The brass nameplate reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through the window. Ethan gently ran his thumb across the engraved letters while a quiet smile appeared beneath eyes already filling with tears. It was not the expression of a man overcome by despair. It was the face of someone remembering every joyful mile they had shared together. He closed his eyes, and memories arrived as softly as falling snow. He remembered a playful young German shepherd chasing pine cones during training exercises in Colorado. He remembered Ghost patiently teaching the younger dog to wait for silent commands instead of spoken ones. He remembered early mornings filled with frost, coffee, wagging tails, and the simple comfort of never beginning a day alone. Those moments had never appeared in military reports or official records. Yet they had become the true measure of a life spent together. Claire quietly looked away, giving Ethan the privacy of grief, but a soft sound drew everyone's attention back toward the bed. Ghost had risen without anyone noticing. He walked slowly to Ethan's side and lowered his head until it rested gently against the wooden box. His nose remained there for several silent seconds. Then, with remarkable tenderness, he nudged the collar once before looking up into Ethan's eyes. The gesture was so simple that no words could ever improve it. Ethan placed one hand upon Ghost's neck while the other continued holding Valor's collar. "He stayed with us until the very end," he whispered, his voice rough but steady. That was always who he was. The physician quietly nodded before leaving the room, closing the door behind him. Evening sunlight stretched across the polished floor, wrapping both man and dog in warm golden light that seemed almost out of place after the frozen mountain where they had been found. Claire finally opened her notebook. The first sentence came effortlessly. It was not about survival. It was not about rescue. It was about loyalty that continued even after one faithful heart had fallen silent. As she finished writing the final word, Ethan carefully fastened Valor's collar around the wooden frame of the photograph that had been recovered from his jacket, placing it beside the hospital window where the fading sunlight rested upon it like a quiet blessing. Ghost settled once more beside the bed, his breathing calm for the first time since the rescue. The room felt different now. The grief had not disappeared, but it no longer stood alone. It had been joined by gratitude, memory, and a promise that the bond shared by three companions could never be measured only by the days they spent together, but by the love that continued long after the storm had passed. 2 days later, the hospital no longer felt like a place where lives were merely preserved. It had quietly become a place where broken hearts learned how to breathe again. The winter sun lingered longer each afternoon, pouring warm light across the hallways and slowly melting the heavy silence that had settled over everyone since the rescue. Ethan was now able to sit beside the window for short periods, wrapped in a thick blanket, while physical therapists encouraged him to regain his strength one careful step at a time. Ghost remained close enough that their shadows almost touched whenever sunlight stretched across the polished floor. Claire visited every morning, not because an editor demanded updates, but because she felt responsible for telling the story exactly as it deserved to be told. During one quiet conversation, she finally asked the question that had rested in her heart since the day on the mountain. What happened out there? Ethan looked through the glass toward the snow-covered hills in the distance before answering. His voice remained calm, carrying none of the bitterness Claire expected. "We were never lost," he said softly. "The storm found us before we could reach shelter." He paused, gently rubbing Ghost behind one ear. "When everything disappeared in the snow, I told them to stay together. They never questioned it. They simply stayed." Claire listened without interrupting. Ethan continued after another thoughtful silence. "Valor kept circling farther and farther away. I thought he was confused at first. Then I realized he was searching for any sign of people, any sound, any trail that might lead someone back to us. Every time he returned, Ghost stayed beside me. One searched for hope, the other protected it." Claire lowered her eyes as the pieces quietly fell into place. The mountain had never divided their mission. It had simply given each faithful companion a different role. Later that afternoon, one of the rescue rangers stopped by the hospital carrying a small waterproof case recovered during a final search of the area. Inside rested a damaged handheld locator beacon, its casing cracked by ice and time. The ranger smiled gently as he explained that investigators believed the beacon had finally transmitted a weak emergency signal shortly before the storm reached its worst. Ethan nodded slowly. "That was Valor." Claire looked at him with quiet surprise. Ethan smiled for the first time in days. He had been trained to recognize that sound during search exercises. If he could not wake me, he knew exactly what to find. No one spoke for several moments. Ghost quietly lifted his head at the mention of his partner's name before resting it once more across Ethan's knee. There was no sadness in his eyes now, only the peaceful certainty of a promise fulfilled. Claire closed her notebook after writing the final sentence of her article. She realized the greatest miracle had never been a single dog opening his eyes in the snow. It had been two loyal hearts making different choices for the same reason, one refusing to leave his partner, the other refusing to stop searching for a way to bring help home. Looking across the room, she understood that courage was not always loud, and heroism was not always remembered by medals or headlines. Sometimes it survived only in quiet footprints left behind in fresh snow, leading strangers exactly where they needed to go. 3 weeks later, the mountains looked different. The deep drifts that had once swallowed the trails had begun to soften beneath the first gentle touch of early spring sunlight. Patches of green quietly emerged between melting snowbanks, and narrow streams carried fresh mountain water through the pines with the steady sound of new beginnings. Ethan stood at the edge of the overlook wrapped in a heavy field jacket, his movements slower than before but stronger with every passing day. Beside him sat Ghost, his thick sable coat glowing beneath the afternoon light, his amber eyes watching the valley with the same calm vigilance that had carried them both through the longest night of their lives. Claire stood several yards away, camera lowered once again. She had returned not to gather another headline, but to witness the ending the story had quietly earned. Her article had traveled far beyond Montana, touching veterans, search and rescue volunteers, dog handlers, and families across the country. Readers praised Ethan's courage, yet the letters arriving at the hospital spoke just as often about Ghost and valor. Children mailed hand-drawn pictures of three friends walking through the snow together. Former service members shared stories of partners who had carried them through impossible days. Complete strangers wrote that they had called an old friend, adopted a shelter dog, or simply told someone they loved them because one quiet story had reminded them that tomorrow should never be taken for granted. Ethan slowly walked toward a young pine tree overlooking the valley. At its base rested a simple stone bearing only one name: Valor. No medals, no titles, no long inscription. Just the name of a faithful companion whose greatest achievement had never needed to be carved into granite because it already lived inside every heart he had touched. Ethan knelt with careful effort and placed the weathered leather collar beside the stone. Ghost stepped forward, lowered his head, and rested his nose gently against it for one peaceful moment before lifting his eyes toward the endless horizon. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine, melting snow, and clean earth. It felt less like goodbye than gratitude. Claire quietly wiped away a tear before finally raising her camera. This time she pressed the shutter, not because she wanted proof of sorrow, but because she wanted people to remember hope. The photograph captured a recovering man standing beside the loyal dog who had refused to leave him and the quiet memorial of the friend whose final act had guided help through the storm. No one smiled for the picture, yet peace filled every corner of the frame. As the afternoon sun dipped lower behind the western ridge, Ethan clipped a new identification tag onto Ghost's collar. The small piece of polished metal caught the golden light before Ghost looked up at him with complete trust. Ethan gently scratched behind his ears and whispered, "We carry him forward together." Ghost answered by leaning softly against his side, exactly as he had done on countless mornings before the storm. Claire watched them walk down the winding trail until they became two quiet silhouettes moving toward the promise of another day. The footprints they left behind would disappear with the changing season, but the path they had shown would remain. Because sometimes the greatest miracles are not found in extraordinary moments. Sometimes they are found in ordinary acts of faith, quiet loyalty, and love that refuses to walk away, even when the whole world is covered in snow.